You know I'm getting that real good.
You want to take a picture of the monkeys?
I did.
Oh, did you? There's about a dozen. Oh, there's a house that goes up. Look at that.
That gecko's on a 62-year-old.
This tree is 7 years old. This tree is 70 years old. All of these trees are very, very old. This palm tree is 70 years old. Correction. This tree was 82 years old. The container is 70 years old. 7 years old. This little tree is 26 years old.
Archie, you're a turkey.
Yeah, I
Okay, Don, that's all. Don.
That's where you all live, right there.
Yeah, the other end.
The other end of it.
Yeah, we're going to go back up there and let them stand in front of the door.
I'm ashamed of it.
Well,
It's
Vivian,
the first
I
looking
like
one
it.
here.
It's pretty.
But it's not at all.
Isn't this nice back here, though?
Our plumerias are all gone. No bananas.
And what is this right here, Archie?
Living in there.
It's a lagoon.
Is this just a lagoon?
It's just a lagoon that they dug in here. I don't know why they dug it in here.
Oh.
Building this up, I guess. Reggie.
Uh-huh. That's a convertible.
That's the one at the top of
737, isn't it?
Yeah.
Archie?
Go ahead. Get her a picture.
Archie, honey, come around here. You can't take the picture.
Home Sweet Home. Well,
Oh, I need to get a picture of this.
Of the house. Yeah, there's nobody else. You know?
what we're going home on. Ford Island. We're looking up the channel toward Honolulu, the area where Ricky Vivian
Yes, sir. See it on
The sun's coming up.
All I can see is the back of somebody's head. All I can see is the back of somebody's head. Can you see anything?
Wasn't just you bringing your camera, was there?
You get a top of a lot of people's heads.
You see anything? What's that supposed to be? Climb up in that tree. Zacchaeus, come down. Hey, we could crawl up through.
You'll manifest your glory in our midst as we think and contemplate upon this great sacrifice. We pray now, Father, particularly for the families, friends, and loved ones, those whose remains lie buried here. You'll continue to comfort and give them grace. Now, O Lord, be particularly with our President as he speaks to our hearts. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Ed Berwinski, Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm pleased to have all of you join me in welcoming the President and Mrs. Bush to this special ceremony, and in so doing to this very special VA National Cemetery. This is one of the most famous, certainly the most impressive, and one of the most beautiful of all our national cemeteries. Most appropriate that this week we build up to this momentous moment of commemoration of a great historic event of 50 years ago, a historic event that turned out to produce the best in America after the tragic consequences were felt here. That we especially remember those men and women who served in that terrible moment, who are buried here in the famous Punch Bowl. We at the VA have a very special feeling of obligation to see that this unique and wonderful cemetery is always not only a quiet resting place, especially beautiful and impressive resting place for our veterans who served our nation so well. Thank all of you for the wonderful role you played in making this entire commemoration so impressive, so meet with that wonderful group of men and women. President Jerry Glaubus.
Thank you, Mr. Lewinsky. Mr. President, Mr. Lewinsky, Reverend Morgan, distinguished guests, and most of all, fellow Pearl Harbor survivors. I welcome you in joining us in this very hallowed place in memory of that fateful day 50 years ago. We are very honored to have with us a gentleman who I feel is one of the greatest Americans I've ever met. Shortly after my election as National President in 1990, I received a call to visit the White House for a briefing by the President of the United States on Operation Desert Storm. During that briefing, the President solicited the views of veterans organizations represented in that meeting and took their opinions and recommendations to heart. He has been extremely supportive and a good friend of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. There's no better way to say it, he's one of us. Before I invite the President to the podium, I would like to speak briefly about the flag on my right. The flag encased in his chest is a 45 by 90 foot 1941 era 48-star American flag commissioned by the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. It was first unfurled during formal standoff ceremonies conducted by the United States Navy, the National Park Rangers, and the Massachusetts State Police in Boston on November 3rd, 1991. After touring the country, the flag will be permanently stored above the World War II destroyer USS Cassin Young. The USS Cassin Young bears the name of the Navy commander. By the way, he was one of my skippers, awarded the Medal of Honor for his brave actions during the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Mr. President, please join me in dedicating the Pearl Harbor flag.
Who are they talking from?
Right in front of the
TV?
See that statue? Look straight down from it.
Oh, you see, all right.
A little bit of the podium there.
See, straight
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very distinct honor and a pleasure to introduce a fellow veteran, and as I said before, a man we have come to know as one of us, our Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, George Bush.
Please be seated, everybody, and Jerry.
You're a big laugh.
To this wonderful organization. May I salute Secretary Ed Derwinski, Reverend Morgan, and most of all, fellow veterans. From this sacred ground near the waters of Pearl Harbor, we remember the moment when the Pacific Ocean erupted in a storm of fire and blood. We remember a morning when America, where some thought isolation meant security, awoke wounded and reeling, plunged into a desperate fight for world freedom. I remember the crackle of the radio and the voice of our president. We are going to win the war, FDR told us, and we are going to win the peace that follows. And we won the war and secured the peace because American men and women responded bravely and instinctively to their nation's call. Within hours after the cruel surprise attack began, many died, having done what came naturally. They fought for their family and friends, defending the land they loved, and they did not set out to become heroes, but they did. When torpedoes crippled the USS California's ammunition hoists, Warrant Officer Thomas Reeves stood in a smoke-filled passageway and organized a human supply chain to move the ammunition. He worked with all his might till the smoke overcame him. He died that day aboard California, and he rests today in this cemetery. During the attack, Chief Bosun Eddie Hill of the USS Nevada swam from the dock back out to his ship, ignoring the bombs falling all around him. He too died in the attack and rests here. The Bible says, love is strong as death. To die for country, for family, That is the truth, whispered by these rows of martyrs. I remember Ernie Pyle, and I'll bet everybody behind me and in front of me remembers Ernie Pyle too. The greatest of war correspondents, he fell to the enemy machine gun fire in Hiroshima. He lies here in this cemetery among the GIs that he loved and honored so well. His plain-spoken news dispatches from the front reminded us that behind the battle statistics were true life stories of how boys became men and men became heroes. He told us what was happening in the war, how our men were fighting. And by telling the stories of our servicemen to their hometowns and neighborhoods, he helped us understand why we were fighting, how our men-at-arms defended with all their hearts America's deepest ideals. Americans did not wage war against nations or races. We fought for freedom and human dignity against the nightmare of totalitarianism. The world must never forget that the dictatorships we fought, the Hitler and Tojo regimes, committed war crimes and atrocities. Our servicemen struggled and sacrificed, not only in defense of our free way of life, but also in the hope that the blessings of liberty someday might extend to all peoples. Our cause was just and honorable, but not every American action was fully fair. This ground embraces many American veterans whose love of country was put to the test unfairly by our own authorities. These and other natural-born American citizens faced wartime internment, and they committed no crime. They were sent to internment camps simply because their ancestors were Japanese. Other Asian Americans suffered discrimination and even violence because they were mistaken for Japanese. And they too were innocent victims who committed no offense. Here lie valiant servicemen of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and of the Military Intelligence Service, Americans of Japanese ancestry who fought to defeat the Axis in Europe and in the Pacific. Among these, the late Senator Spark Matsunaga, a combat hero and survivor who went on to help lead post-war Hawaii to American statehood. I remember sharing danger and friendship in these skies and on this ocean.
What?
Some of my closest friends, many people here, your closest friends, never came home. Perhaps because of this experience, I could better understand what you survivors of Pearl Harbor are sensing and feeling here today. As all the veterans here know, when a friend or comrade in arms falls in battle, war grabs a part of your soul. My roommate aboard the carrier San Jacinto CBL-30 was Lieutenant Jim Whites as we were about to go into combat for the first time, a strike over Wake Island. Jim Whites and his crew were sent out on a search mission from which they never returned. Many more from our little torpedo squadron were to give their lives, and the names of many of these, and more than 18,000 other World War II servicemen lost in action in the Pacific, are engraved in the walls of this magnificent memorial. During every passage of my life, I've often thought of those who never returned. Some left children behind, and today, those children, like my own kids, are raising children of their own. And thank God, each surviving generation has honored the memory of our heroes of the Second World War. Each new generation has risen to meet the challenge of winning the peace. After vanquishing the dictators of Japan and Germany and Italy, America's war generation helped those countries rebuild and grow strong in the exercise of democracy and free enterprise. They affirmed again that our quarrel had not been with races or nations. The American victors welcomed the new leaders of Japan and Germany and Italy into alliances that won the Cold War and helped prevent the Third World War. America and our wartime allies joined hands with the liberated peoples of our former foes to create and nurture international organizations aimed at protecting human rights, collective security, and economic growth. Winning the peace, then as now, demands preparedness. The cause of harmony among nations is not a call for pacifism. We avoided a Third World War because we were prepared to defend the free world against aggressors. The Pearl Harbor generation saw its younger brothers go to Korea, the sons to Vietnam to resist communism. Pearl Harbor's grandchildren answered the call to the Persian Gulf to reverse Saddam's aggression against Kuwait. How fitting it is that this great cemetery holds so many who died for the cause of Korean and Vietnamese freedom. How honored we are to stand on this ground consecrated with the remains of Marine Lance Corporal Frank Allen of Hawaii, who gave his life just 10 months ago in the Battle of Kuwait. Every soldier and sailor and airman buried here offered his life so that others might be free. Not one of them died in vain. Our men and women who served in Korea and Vietnam, whose sacrifices too often have been forgotten or even reviled, are nearing their day of greatest vindication. For I have confidence that the tragedy of totalitarianism has entered its final scene everywhere on this earth. This morning's sun, of course, the Pacific skies, can illuminate the lands of Asia. Just as certainly, the movement of human freedom will supplant dictatorships that now hold sway in Pyongyang and Rangoon and Hanoi, and yes, in China too. For a billion yearning men and women, the future means freedom, democracy. This fair December dawn breaks on a world ready for renewal. A high tide of hope swells for those that are committed to peace and freedom. The nation pushed by tyrants into war against us half a century ago join us today as free and constructive partners in the effort for peace. Soviet communist designs for world domination collapsed. We've reached this point because generation after generation of Americans kept faith with our founders and our heroes. From the snows of Valley Forge to the fiery seas of Midway and Pearl Harbor to the sands of Iraq and Kuwait, Americans lived and died true to their ideals. They have prepared the way for a world of unprecedented freedom and cooperation. Thank God you Pearl Harbor survivors are here today to see this come to pass. Today, as we remember the sacrifices of our countrymen, I salute all of you, survivors of Pearl Harbor, and I ask all Americans to join me in a prayer. Lord, give our rising generations the wisdom to cherish their freedom and security as hard-won treasures. Lord, give them the same courage that pulsed in the blood of their fathers. May God bless you all, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
And then now he goes. See, that's, yeah. Yeah, that's what this turned into. Whoopie-doo.
Back in that level up there. Yeah, flag. Yeah, let's That's it backing up there.
Right here. Yeah, it is. Uh-huh.
Each car they don't want you to.
Well, this was about the least of anything. I mean, up to now, it's been marvelous. And that's too bad that they didn't have something more.
I'm not really up there anymore.
Here's a young
I got
man.
3 limos there.
Here's a young man buried 1980 time.
1980.
Yeah.
It's full in Arlington.
Is this full?
Maybe our chicks
someone
coincides.
said.
Where did Archie? There they go over there.
Yeah, they kind of wasted it.
Well, he can see to, yeah. I mean,
Nobody's
he
getting
could
a
get.
picture of it.
I wouldn't think so.
Dang, my guy's taking a picture.
He's got to get a lot of grass.
Before he was getting a lot of sky. Like this girl was in a helicopter.
Yeah.
They just hold it out the window, click, click, click.
Yeah, but
No,
then
she
on,
had a picture.
but then on the helicopter, you're gonna. Here comes news.
She wouldn't have even known that she had a picture on it.
Hopefully. Well, I hope all the news corps in the third.
He was waving to me.
Oh, well, you're
Yeah, these whole guys, you look better.
Which one are they in? The one with the flag?
Yeah, the one with the green light.
There they are, right there.
Right there?
Isn't that nice? Right there. Bye. Yeah, bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, many distinguished guests, as we commemorate this turning point in our nation's history, we're fortunate to have with us a military leader who has helped write some history of his own. General Powell was a rifle platoon leader in Germany. He was a battalion advisor in Vietnam, a battalion commander with our forward deployed forces in Korea, a Corps commander in Europe, assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, a 4-star commander of troops, with many honors and many important assignments in between. And since August of 1989, he has led our armed forces through a period of remarkable change. When the dictators challenged our resolve in Panama and Kuwait, General Powell was the senior military officer who directed our successful response. And today, he is one of the key architects of our military structure for the future. A military smaller, but ready to meet the challenges of tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased and proud to introduce the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Admiral Larson. President and Mrs. Bush, Secretary Cheney, Mrs. Rickert, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed an honor to be with you this morning. It's such a beautiful morning that now in my mind's eye I have difficulty seeing this quiet harbor overwhelmed by violence, by destruction, and by death. But so it was 50 years ago, on a morning not too different from this one. We've just come from the Arizona Memorial, where President Bush and Mrs. Bush led us in a most moving ceremony as we remembered the 1,177 men of USS Arizona who lost their lives on that sad Sunday morning. In tribute to those men, President and Mrs. Bush followed an old Hawaiian custom of placing flowers on the water. Those flowers will drift away, but never, never the memory of those who made the supreme sacrifice. Nor will we ever forget the sacrifice of the more than 1,000 other Americans who lost their lives on that day. Pearl Harbor was the first battle for us in the war against fascism, a war we won almost 4 years later in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. And in the course of that war, thousands more Americans would die before ultimate victory was ours. It was a victory which preserved our freedom and democracy, and it was a victory which brought freedom and democracy to our enemies and transformed them into friends and into strong allies. And over the past 45 years, that friendship and those alliances combined to defeat a new tyranny in the Cold War, the tyranny of communism. The Great Crusade that produced these two victories, one over fascism, the other over communism, began for us here on this day, half a century ago. And that tradition of winning continues today in the person of the millions of young men and women of America's armed forces serving proudly around the world. Men and women who brought us victory in Operations Just Cause and Desert Storm. And so it is on their behalf, and it is in their name, that I salute the men of Arizona and all others who served and sacrificed on that fateful day. In the hearts and minds of those who still serve, they will never, never be forgotten. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce a great American who has been leading your armed forces with skill and distinction during one of the most critical and historic periods of the post-war era. The Secretary of Defense, the Honorable Dick Cheney.
Thank you very much, General Powell. President Bush, Mrs. Bush, ladies and gentlemen, we've gathered today to commemorate an event that was both a tragedy and a turning point in American history. Thousands of lives were lost at Pearl Harbor 50 years ago, but one great hope was born, that this nation would never again turn its back on its responsibility to be a world leader. No one has fulfilled that promise better than the man who serves as President of the United States today. George Bush volunteered as a naval aviator in the war that began here at Pearl Harbor. He knew what it was like to serve his nation far from home, to take enemy fire, to struggle, to survive, to see friends die. He knows firsthand the cost of defending freedom. Another who knows the cost of defending freedom is Mrs. Lenore Rickard. 50 years ago today, she was a Navy nurse on duty at the Naval Hospital when the first enemy plane struck Pearl Harbor. When you ask her about that terrible time, she will tell you how everyone else sacrificed and served. But she herself was a heroic member of the hospital's medical team. She immediately went to work to get the hospital ready to treat the injured. She tended to 3 wards of burn patients and worked 48 hours straight without a break. She has said, "No one wanted war, but if it was going to happen, I was glad I was right where I was and could serve." When Mrs. Rickard was finally posted back to the home front, she found it wasn't enough of a challenge. She turned around and applied for service in the Western Pacific, where she distinguished herself as chief nurse of a mobile hospital and later a fleet hospital. She served there for 2 years before returning to stateside duty. Not until the war was over did she lay down the burden of service. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to have the honor to present one of the heroes of Pearl Harbor, Mrs. Lenore Rickert.
Everyone take a deep breath for me. Thank you, Mr. Cheney. When told of the honor that I was to have today, I said, why me? Could I accept the challenge? And then I remembered 50 years ago. And as Mr. Cheney said, I was right where I wanted to be if it was to be. So I guess I'm right where I want to be if it is to be today. I was on duty at the eye, ear, nose, and throat wards of the Navy Hospital, which then was located on Hospital Point, the narrowest part of the channel down here. It is not there now. But our patients, being of eye, ear, nose, and throat variety, were not critically ill or anything. So we were making rounds and had just finished up with the officer of the day making rounds for the Sunday morning when we heard a plane directly overhead. This is very unusual because the plane stayed away from the hospital for obvious reasons. And we thought immediately a plane in distress. And Dr. Chenault and I ran to the window to see a Japanese plane within 35 feet of us. We knew immediately what the problem was. He went back to his office. I went to the nurses' quarters to alert the half of the duty nurses that were off duty on, and came back to the wards. As I came back from the nurses' quarters to the wards, flights of Japanese bombers were overhead, and I could see them coming down in sixes right above my head. And everybody says, were you afraid? No, I wasn't afraid. I guess I didn't know how to be. There was so much to do and so much on my mind that I just rushed back to the wards. Fortunately, because of the type of ward I had, most of those patients could get up, which they did, and they left without ceremony their beds and went back. They had one thing in mind: get back to our ships, and that's exactly what they did. It was an hour before. We had plenty of empty beds then. In fact, we had the whole wards were empty in my division. When the patients started coming in an hour later, many of them came back with the fellows who had left the beds. When they got back to their ships, they found there wasn't anything they could do to help. So the thing on their mind was to get their buddies taken care of. And so they brought their buddies in and stayed right with them. And the sound was, take care of my buddy. He's much worse off than I am. And that was the attitude throughout. And those men stayed with us on the wards to help. Our big problem was the pain. The 3 wards that I had were assigned to burn patients. And all you heard was water, water, water. Well, that was easy enough. We filled buckets with water and put rubber tubes in them and let them have water, and the men took them up and down the aisles. We gave them morphine and immediately started to work on them, and you would be amazed at how many of those buddies became expert nurses almost immediately with a little help and a little guidance. Within hours of the attack, we were under control. Now, the attack was still going on at 10 o'clock, so I can't say that we were under control, but we didn't know that. Because of the efforts of many, a lot of you are here today with your families because of the help you got that morning from your fellow men and from your nurses at the hospital. On behalf of the nurses, both Army and Navy, who served here that infamous day, I have the honor of introducing a man who went to war, who fought to serve his country, a man who was shot down and nursed back to health to resume his duty and to fight again. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Isn't she magnificent? Thank you very much. Thank you all, and please be seated. Mrs. Rickard, thank you for that wonderful tale of how it was at Hospital Point. Thank you for that warm and generous introduction. And now I have a favor to ask of you. I hope you and everyone else will take a deep breath for me too, please. You didn't need it, but I might. This is a very emotional day. I would like to salute the members of my cabinet that are here today, particularly Dick Cheney. Our able Secretary of Defense has done so much for the military, so much in terms of leadership for our nation. I want to salute General Powell, the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, and again take this opportunity on this historic day to thank him for his leadership, his inspirational leadership for all the men and women that serve in the armed forces. I want to thank the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Larson, and I especially want to single out all the fellow veterans here, particularly those who are the survivors of this historic day. I expect if we went around the room, all of us would remember. I remember exactly when I first heard the news about Pearl Harbor. I was 17 years old, walking across the green at school, and my thoughts in those days didn't turn to world events, mainly to simpler things, more mundane things, like making the basketball team or entering college. And that walk across the campus marked an end of innocence for me. And when Americans heard the news, they froze in shock. But just as quickly, we came together. Like all American kids back then, I was swept up in it. I decided that very day to go into the Navy, to become a Navy pilot. And so on my 18th birthday, June 12th, 1942, I was sworn into the Navy as a seaman second class. And I was shocked. I was shocked at my first sight of Pearl Harbor several months later, April of '44. We came into port on the CVL-30 on the carrier San Jacinto. And nearby, the Utah was still on her side. Parts of the Arizona still stood silent in the water. Everywhere the skeletons of ships reached out as if to demand remembrance and warn us of our own mortality. Over 2,000 men died in a matter of minutes on this site a half a century ago. Many more died that same day as Japanese forces assaulted the Philippines and Guam and Wake Island, Midway, Malaya, Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong. On that day of infamy, Pearl Harbor propelled each of us into a titanic contest for mankind's future. It galvanized the American spirit as never, ever before into a single-minded resolve that could produce only one thing: victory. Churchill knew it as soon as he heard the news. He'd faced the Nazi conquest of Europe, the Blitz of London, the terror of the U-boats, but when America was attacked, he declared there was no more doubt about the end. He knew then that the American spirit would not fail the cause of freedom. The enemy mistook our diversity, our nation's diversity, for weakness. But Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry for men and women from all walks of life, all colors and creeds, and in the end, this unity of purpose made us invincible in war and now makes us secure in peace. The next day, President Roosevelt proclaimed the singular American objective: with confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. It was the steadfastness of the American people that would win the war and win the peace that follows. We triumphed in both, despite the fact that the American people did not want to be drawn into the conflict. The unsought war, it's been called. Ironically, isolationists gathered together at what was known in those days as an American First rally in Pittsburgh, at precisely the moment the first Americans met early violent deaths right here at Pearl Harbor. The isolationists failed to see that the seeds of Pearl Harbor were sown back in 1919, when a victorious America decided that in the absence of a threatening enemy abroad, we should turn all of our energies inward. That notion of isolationism flew escort for the very bombers that attacked our men 50 years ago. Again in 1945, some called for America's return to isolationism, as if abandoning world leadership was the prerequisite for dealing with pressing matters back home. And they were rudely awakened by the brutal reality of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet blockade of Berlin, and the communist invasion of South Korea. And now we stand triumphant. For the third time this century, this time in the wake of the Cold War. As in 1919 and 1945, we faced no enemy menacing our security. And yet we stand here today on the site of a tragedy spawned by isolationism. And it is here, and we must learn, and this time avoid, the dangers of today's isolationism and its economic accomplice, protectionism. To do otherwise, to believe that turning our backs on the world would improve our lot here at home, is to ignore the tragic lessons of the 20th century. The fact is, this country has enjoyed its most lasting growth and security when we rejected isolationism, both political and economic, in favor of engagement and leadership. We're a Pacific nation, and next month in Asia, I'll discuss with our Pacific friends and allies their responsibility to share with us the challenges and burdens of leadership in the post-Cold War world. The time has come for America's trading partners in Europe and Asia and around the world to resolve that economic isolationism is wrong. To the leaders of Japan in particular, I say this solemn occasion should reinforce our determination to join together in a future energized by free markets and free people. And so I'll continue to speak out against the voices of isolationism and protectionism, both at home and abroad. 50 years ago, we paid a heavy price for complacency and overconfidence. That too is a lesson we shall never forget. To those who have defended our country, from the shores of Guadalcanal to the hills of Korea, from the jungles of Vietnam to the sands of Kuwait, I say this: we will always remember. We will always be prepared to take on aggression, prepared to step forward in reconciliation, and prepared to secure the peace. In remembering, it is important to come to grips with the past. No nation can fully understand itself or find its place in the world if it does not look with clear eyes at all the glories and disgraces, too, of the past. We in the United States acknowledge such an injustice in our own history. The internment of Americans of Japanese ancestry was a great injustice, and it'll never be repeated. Today, all Americans should acknowledge Japan's Prime Minister Miyazawa's national statement of deep remorse concerning the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a thoughtful, it was a difficult expression, much appreciated by the people of the United States of America. The values we hold dear as a nation, equality of opportunity, freedom of religion and speech and assembly, free and vigorous elections, are now revered by many nations. Our greatest victory in World War II took place not on the field of battle, but in nations we once counted as foes. The ideals of democracy and liberty have triumphed in a world once threatened with conquest by tyranny and despotism. Today, as we celebrate the world's evolution toward freedom, we commemorate democracy's fallen heroes, the defenders of freedom, as well as the victims of dictatorship who never saw the light of liberty. Earlier this year, when former adversaries joined us in the stand against aggression in the Persian Gulf, we affirmed the values cherished by the heroes of the harbor. The friends that I lost, that all of us lost, upheld a great and noble cause. Because of their sacrifice, the world now lives in greater freedom and peace than ever before. It is right that all of us are here today. And it is right that we go on from here. As you know, I just paid my respects at Arizona, where it all began. And behind us stands Missouri, where it came to an end. But the Missouri was also a beginning. Soon after that, Emperor Hirohito went to call on General MacArthur, who later noted that the emperor played a major role in the spiritual regeneration of Japan. Their meeting made history, and a hopeful future for a democratic Japan began to take shape. I thought of that meeting with MacArthur when I attended the emperor's funeral in 1989. I thought of it this morning, too, at the National Cemetery of the Pacific, and then at the Arizona Memorial. As you look back on life and retrace the steps that made you the person you are, you pick out the turning points, the defining moments. Over the years, Pearl Harbor still defines a part of who I am. To every veteran here, and indeed to all Americans, Pearl Harbor defines a part of who you are. Recently, a letter arrived from the son of a Pearl Harbor survivor, a Navy man named Bill Liu, who is with us here today. His son writes from his home, now in Tokyo, saying, "A half-century ago, My father's thoughts were on surviving the attack and winning the war. He could not have envisioned a future where his son would study and work in Japan. But he recognizes that the world has changed, that America's challenges are different. My father's attitude represents that of the United States. Do your duty and raise the next generation to do its. I can understand Bill's feelings. I wondered how I'd feel being with you, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the survivors, on this very special day. And I wonder if I would feel that intense hatred that all of us felt for the enemy 50 years ago. As I thought back to that day of infamy and the loss of friends, I wondered, what will my reaction be when I go back to Pearl Harbor? What will their reaction be? The other old veterans, especially those who survived that terrible day, right here. But let me tell you how I feel. I have no rancor in my heart towards Germany or Japan. None at all. And I hope, in spite of the loss, that you have none in yours. This is no time for recrimination. World War II is over. It is history. We won. We crushed totalitarianism, and when that was done, we helped our enemies give birth to democracy. We reached out, both in Europe and in Asia. We made our enemies our friends, and we healed their wounds, and in the process, we lifted ourselves up. The lessons of the war itself will live on, and well they should. Preparedness, strength, decency and honor, courage, sacrifice, the willingness to fight, even die for one's country. America, the land of the free and the brave. No, just speaking for one guy, I have no rancor in my heart. I can still see the faces of the fallen comrades, and I'll bet you can see the faces of your fallen comrades too, or family members. But don't you think they're saying 50 years have passed? Our country is the undisputed leader of the free world, and we are at peace? Don't you think each one is saying, I did not die in vain? May God bless each of you who sacrificed and served, and may God grant his loving protection to this, the greatest country on the face of the earth, the United States of America. Thank you all, and God bless you.
Again, trying to heal the old wound that some of these veterans have admitted is still there. Waving to the crowd.
'67-year-old George Bush, the man who will, in all likelihood, be the last American president to have fought in World War II. A very patriotic, inspirational message at Kilo Pier. And if you're wondering from a historical standpoint, Dan Martinez standing by here in the studio. Dan, there's no particular historical significance to Kilo Pier, is there?
No, there isn't a Pearl Harbor attack, but just behind Kilo Pier was the oil storage tank farm that plays such a critical role in the review of the strategic review of the historians of whether the attack was successful or not, because those storage tanks are what fed the fleet in the later actions. it was really interesting to hear the President's remarks and working at the Arizona Memorial. I was really moved that he addressed this issue. This is an issue that we have had to be very, very careful about. And then now that our president has spoken on this issue, we can now speak to the visitors with a little more of authority on what our public view is now and what our stand is. And I just took great comfort in his words, and I thought that it was very courageous to say them.
Man who was 17 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked. You heard George Bush recount his thoughts on that day when he was at school in Hanover, Michigan, how he then enlisted in the Navy to become a pilot. His first coming into Pearl Harbor aboard the cruiser San Jacinto. He did not actually refer to specifically being shot down, but he was by Japanese anti-aircraft fire while on a bombing run in 1944.
Interesting how he became not only the president, but yet just another war veteran, sharing his thoughts with those who have so many similar thoughts here. He is going now over to the USS Missouri, and he will be leaving Admiral Larson at that point and actually doing some television interviews, then goes on to the headquarters of the Pacific Air Forces for more private meetings before his departure in the middle of the day.
You know, Barbara, I found it very interesting that out of all the presidents that we have, and President Reagan before President Bush, how ironic that a Pacific War veteran would be leading the country and have the kind of power base, both politically and historically, to utter those words. I think if they were uttered by anybody else besides George Bush, they wouldn't have had the impact that they will have on the veterans and on the country.
No rancor in his heart, he said. And again, he wove through all three of these speeches today the fact that America can no longer turn back to an isolation point of view, that is an emotionally bankrupt idea for this nation to perceive. We must be members of the world community. And again, he brought up in his final speech the matter of the Japanese Americans who were unjustly interned during the war.
Windsurfing. I'm not in the sun, I'm down on the water. That old boy fall in down there? He turned it over.
He's right himself up. Look at him. There he goes.
On again. There, another one went under.
So they stop and go back out. Some of them have gone a long way out.
Boy, those guys are way out there. Diamond Head, overlooking the area where we saw the sail surfers, wind surfers. Not too impressive, this location. We're up high on the edge of it.
Oh, okay.
are out rigger canoes that they use in competition. They hold 6 men paddle. There's one of the competitors standing there now. Hands on hips, raring to go. They're is waving their fan.
Look at the yacht coming in. Don?
A couple of yachts coming in here.
Don?
Practically walking.
Look out coming in the harbor, the one with 2 masts.
Boy, they got a bunch of them.
Boy, that's a beauty. We'll come back down here tomorrow when it's daylight and take pictures. Or in the
Hey, that's one of those catamarans, one of those big ones.
early afternoon we could come down, Don.
Well, quit getting. Here comes 3 in under sail. Old Bill Woods would have a fit out here, wouldn't he? Many masks, looks like a forest fire. Looks like Yellowstone Park. That one out there now with 4 masks. Wait just a minute, let me get. I'm sweeping these shacks across the street here. That's the big ones. Three-wheel taxi. The wind is really blowing.
Archie. Get back over there by Archie. Diamond, get back over there.
That was her body.
they're just telling about her pretty eyes and her turn around to the right, to the left. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Do this every night. If you're sitting out here, they come every night, and usually he comes and he has a ball, and he just join, you know, with the torches. This is what I thought we'd, you know, what I thought we'd have. We'd be tropical. We'd be ready. That's why I was so disappointed.
Just the scene looking back on our motel. Can't see it for the palm trees. There's two large hotels in either side. This is the view of Diamond Head from Waikiki. Yacht Basin. Zooming in. An old extinct volcano crater. thing.
Where we're staying is much nicer than this. She's got money hanging all over her dress.
Money hanging.
Uh-huh. Vivian. Vivian.
That's the stage where the girls perform.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Archie said, wake him up about 3 this morning. He's looking like that. So he could have been sleeping in that argument. Her back through into the apartment, and that's all open.
It's looking west at night. It's on the balcony. Oh, we got the Christmas lights up all down there.
This looks like something that they
It's not,
won. Porsche.
It's a kind of commemorative
This
thing.
is, I bet you this is one of the rallies they won. That is really neat.
Oh, that is so strange that you got me this
William
quilt.
Towson.
That is really neat.
And you know, Mother gave me that piece of quilt.
I had been planning to do that for a
Isn't
long time. and I saw that.
Who's that from, Lois? How does it run down? Your quilt, piece of quilt.
Here, look, well, hand me
Let me
some.
see how that.
Here, Wilbur.
So cute.
Yeah. Is that for the day?
Yeah, first place. You're supposed to put those on your dash.
Oh, how cute, Lois. That's real cute.
These are the yearly.
That's
What is this?
what I need. Smile.
What is this
What is
thing?
this distributor award?
Oh, now this is what ours needs.
That's the
Distributor.
Black quilts.
The Porsche.
In other words, they gave an award for the best Porsche.
For the best score, for the best Porsche, and we were first place.
Lives
So we
close
won.
together. This smiles,
That's really neat.
I thought you'd like that.
I really, yeah, I think I'm gonna.
And that came off of our.
Oh, I think
that
it's,
little.
oh, it's stitches,
You did
all
have this on your
smiles,
dash?
and
No, the other
tears,
little thing.
colors.
Oh.
That came off of our Porsche.
And,
That was all we had left of it.
Think about this, Gaga.
And that's a dash.
Gaga.
I thought that was a dead issue.
Yes, I got that in the museum.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Isn't that pretty?
Just
You could wrap it around you.
Oh, you're gonna get your,
I don't know if there's
your
enough wrap
present,
around
you're
me.
gonna get me tomorrow
It would,
from
you
it.
know, take on your crimson.
Yeah.
This is what I think it is. I think it's
I
gonna
tell you, you better wear some
It
kind of
may not do a lot in the snow, but
Well, now.
you better wear some kind of an undergarment. It's pretty thin.
yeah.
As I say, it's pretty sheer.
Under that.
You and
I'll be
Shannon
able
about
to run real
broke.
fast once.
Yeah, that's probably where it's gonna go. No, Shannon, he's gonna run me broke. Diane said he was,
Lois Older,
he's gonna, looking forward to me getting down there so
proud
I
of you.
can
Let me give you a little hug.
contribute to the.
That's your little present right there.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, but it's not like yours.
What you got there, William?
Did you make these or did you buy
Yeah, I
them?
made them.
Did you buy them?
I
Did
made
you
them.
make them?
I made them when I was up in Wyoming.
Stick my hand in the oven with it.
Well, that looks like Christmas, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's
Hey,
so
Bruno,
pretty here, aren't they pretty?
And the,
Ah, William.
Yes,
Pretty,
too.
Lois. You did such a good,
You mean more money?
you got this in the fabric and then you just fixed it.
Yeah.
You better wash those couches.
I know what you got.
I tried to make some of that stuff.
Look at him looking at
You
it.
got real
Espresso.
A bigger picture.
pretty.
A
That's a
bigger
nice
picture.
size.
Oh, that's
Too much.
That's right.
Who gave that to you? Me?
It's not real big, but it's probably about big enough.
Oh, it's perfect.
Big for two.
It's wonderful.
Big enough for Don.
Yeah, I thought about ours.
Yeah.
Oh, did you get this from Hawaii?
That's all right. You don't have to look
I
at
got a
it.
feeling
Yeah.
today.
That's a little bit of a.
Pop can tell you something about the big stuff that they got over there to make them a little money. They started making stuff.
Thank you.
Well, I didn't know, the big surprise me is this to you.
Oh, good, I got some too.
Leah,
All of a sudden I realized that.
those two dogs that we gave away, one of them a little boy and a little girl, do you know what their names are?
Yeah.
Nene and Papa.
They named it.
Oh, are you serious?
Nina and Poppy.
Who did you give them to?
Yeah.
Have you opened it?
Yeah, Poppy. But you know, we just had so many.
John, but this is beautiful. Did you make these?
Don, take a picture of your dad.
You know, I've been using those ones you made me last year
You
or
get
several
away
years
from
ago.
And this is like.
Oh, I got a lot of good use. I mean, they got a lot of life
Oh,
yet.
it's not the same pattern.
Oh, this is beautiful.
Don't do that, boy.
So,
Your light's flashing, Dad. Your battery's probably low.
Yeah, it's low. It's about down.
well,
That's far over the door.
I need to
Run out of power.
It is. That's
Is
really
trash
good.
here?
Hey, Jay, what'd you get there? Drawing board?
This is
Made it like that.
if this is what I think it is. This is friend that she got me what? Wilding.
I didn't know what to buy.
With an Indian show. Real neat friend.
Writing on it.
A friend of mine.
Jackson Hole,
Are these to eat?
That's
Oh,
cool.
how pretty.
91.
Are these to eat? God, are these coffee beans?
Oh, that's pretty.
When you think you want a cup of
That's
coffee,
some
somebody
really
throws
pretty.
it
Oh
in.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Is that Ryan?
This is
What is it?
artist here.
Coffee beans.
They're chocolate covered coffee beans.
Never heard of
Coffee
that.
And they're to eat. But you
Oh,
don't want to eat too many of them.
I'm
You get
getting
too high.
reflection on it there. Tilted a little bit. There you
Here,
go.
you sit down and let somebody else take
That's
some, so you'll be inside.
It's a nice dancer.
Hey, did you try it?
Did
Oh,
you get my
yeah,
pretty?
the place we went to, the Tona Coffee Company,
That's
they had
Chuck,
them out
that's
in a
Will
dish,
Slender.
and
Give
we
it back
could,
to me.
you know,
Got
take
a
them.
little frame.
Oh, yeah.
And then they had them for sale, you know. How about that? Who ever heard of that?
Well, I'll tell you what.
Chocolate covered coffee
Here,
beans.
let me-
And
Fireplace. Oh, no, don't tell me you're left-eyed.
Left-eyed,
Oh, my.
so am I.
See it say REC? Don't move it too, don't move it too fast.
You know, Donovan, also many of our movies when we
Take
used
the presents out,
to,
we'll
we
take
move
it
so
back.
fast that we're just, they're not very
Linda,
good.
you want me to just wait for Christmas?
Lois, your trees sure look good.
Thank you.
He got it, not one of all, but.
I guess you made your skirt for it.
No, Ann, Wilson did that. We have a skirt under
Turn
our
it off,
shirt.
because when you move it around,
It's
it
beautiful.
makes you sick.
Beautiful. Watch you.
Oh, God, they had gotten these wild.
I want you.
Tree skirt for our tree.
You.
Oh, is that right?
Look out!
Backyard to get it. Letting him have it.
Yeah.
I'm real proud. I mean,
Wait a minute, take me and Leah and Nene.
We could get her
Turn
to
it
do
off,
it.
Will.
We
You
could
run
sit her
around
in
with
here
it. Point it to the ground.
Her two favorite grandmas.
Yeah, her two favorite grandmothers.
Is she left-eyed?
And only. You see my recipe cards, Mother?
He
Aren't
didn't
they
shoot a gun
cute?
left-eyed.
Recipe cards.
So cute. What's Santa Claus gonna bring you, Will?
Oh, are all of them that way? Every card? Oh, that's just real good, because you don't want to get a recipe for somebody you want to put where the guy from.
That's so good.
Glad you got to see me.
Yeah, thank you. Y'all have a safe trip
Isn't that
and a good
awful?
trip.
Hurry,
Enjoy yourself.
Oh.
Did you going with Marcy?
Sure.
That-